So we're going to have to resolder that point to the motherboard. And when we jiggle the power adapter, you'll be able to see that pin inside move up and down and not really be soldered strongly to the motherboard. And that's what we're going to be fixing here. So to get to that point, we got to take the motherboard out of the machine, because we need to get to the top part of the jack and we got to get to the bottom part of the jack. So we can only get to the bottom from here. So we're going to take the motherboard out of the bottom case. Now I'm unscrewing screws from the motherboard. Usually on a motherboard, if you see that white arrow I'm pointing at there, a white arrow will point to the screws that you need to take out to get the motherboard out. There's several other screws in that motherboard that I'm not taking out. Usually, it will guide you. Only the ones with the white arrows, only the screws that are next to the white arrows are the ones you should have to take out to get the whole motherboard out. So you'll see I didn't need to take the fan off or the PCMCIA slot or a couple other things, just because I followed the white arrows and just took those 4 or 5 screws out that kept the motherboard in. Now that the motherboard's out, we're going to operate here. We're going to fix that power jack using a special technique that I do. But first, since we got the motherboard out, we're going to hit it with some compressed air. That was time-lapsed right there. I actually took it outside and I blew all the air out. There's a lot of dust that accumulates in that fan, and now that you have access to it, you might as well take advantage of that and just blow it out. Okay, so I'm taking a look here, just inspecting the best way to go about attacking this problem. And I'm just going to get some materials here, like a soldering iron. That's just a typical 15-watt Radio Shack soldering iron that I'm using. And I'm going to pull some other tools out here. I'm going to get a file. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to file off a spot on the motherboard where I can reattach the power jack. See, what we're going to do is a technique that I like to do where I use a wire to reattach the power jack to the motherboard. I use a wire because it has flexibility and it won't be as brittle as attaching the actual pin from the power jack straight to the motherboard. They have a tendency, if it breaks once, it's going to have a tendency to keep breaking. So I'm going to use a technique here where I use a wire in place of the actual post, the actual pin that comes out of the center of the back of the power jack. The first thing I need to do is scuff off, file down a bare spot on that motherboard where that pin actually attaches to, where the power jack pin actually attaches to. Okay, now that that's filed down, I'm also going to attach a pin right to the back of the power jack. And then I'm going to wrap that wire from the pin down to the other underside of the motherboard and solder it at both ends. Now I'm filing this down. The reason I file it is so the solder will stick. I want to make a good solder connection because I don't want this ever to break again. There's the solder. The soldering iron should be hot enough. Now, I'm not a soldering professional, so my techniques might not be by the book, but they work for me, and that's why I'm going to show you what I do. First, I'm going to cut a piece of wire the right length to wrap from the top of the power jack around the underside of the motherboard, and which will attach to the spot that we filed out on the underside of the motherboard. And that length of wire should do it. Now what I'm going to use here is a little device called Helping Hands I got at Radio Shack. It's actually missing one of its alligator clips, so it's actually a helping hand, but it'll work for what we're doing. And all it does is it allows you to hold things while you work on them. It's like an extra set of hands. Okay, what I did there with the helping hand was solder both ends of that wire, which I didn't catch on film, but I'll show you afterwards. And then I just put a dab of solder on the back of the power jack there. On that spot I was filing, right at the back of the power jack, that pin. It's the positive point. The whole outside of that power jack, the metal on the outside is negative. That's ground, your ground connection. And my hand's in the way, but you'll see the finished product. I will hold it up to the camera. I just soldered that wire to the back of the power jack. And then I bent it around the underside of the motherboard. And now I'm going to solder it to the point that we filed down on the underside of the motherboard. Now that point on the underside of the motherboard, which right now I'm attaching, I'm just putting a little drop of solder on it. And then I'm going to just take the wire, which also has solder on the end of the wire already, which I did with the helping hands. I'm just going to melt that point onto the point of the motherboard where I just dropped a piece of solder. Now that point on the motherboard that we filed earlier, you need to make sure that that point is the exact spot that the pin from the power jack actually connects to on the motherboard. You can't just connect it to any spot on the motherboard. It has to be, you have to find out where that pin on the power jack goes to on the motherboard, and then you have to attach the solder or the wire to that point, which you'll see right there. Now I'm going to freeze frame that. Now notice that wire is attached to the motherboard right where that pin comes through the underside of the motherboard. It's essentially the same contact point. That's very important. You could tell it's the same contact point because of the light green color. Well, now that that's connected, and we tested with the pliers to make sure it was a strong connection, the soldering is essentially done. Give it a little tug, make sure it's secure. And you'll see that basically what we're doing here is bypassing the pin for the power jack with the wire. It's better to use a wire, in my opinion, because of the flexibility, like I said before. Now what we're going to do is clear off the desk a little bit and start to put everything back together. Put the soldering iron away, put the helping hands, wires away, files away. Now that you have the motherboard out, hit it with some compressed air. Now's your chance to make sure the motherboard is clean. It's fully exposed. You might as well take that opportunity and clean it up a little bit. And we're going to take the bottom case, we're going to slip the motherboard back in. Take out my trusty paintbrush here and just paint the dust off of the... It's just a bare paintbrush, never been touched by paint.